How can Christianity be true if the Bible cannot be trusted? The New Testament was written and completed by the end of the first century. But what about the originals, the autographs? If we don't have them, can we trust the New Testament and the message behind it? Welcome back to the channel. Let's dive right in. The originals and New Testament textual criticism. This is to talk about the artifacts, the material culture, the actual material part of the New Testament. Can we trust the New Testament if we don't have the original documents? Well, skeptics are going to say no. The New Testament is based on dated copies. It's too old. It's too corrupted. It's full of errors. There have been all kinds of scribal additions and changes, adding and removing doctrine. And reasons for these doubts come from popularizers, from works of fiction, which we'll look at soon. Of course, the internet is no shortage for ignorance. Bart Ehrman, who's a bona fide textual critic, certainly has done some damage in this realm. You'll see that he has one opinion sometimes within scholarly circles, and with popularizers and with the public, he can say some other things. And also, of course, mythicist advocates will certainly say there are all kinds of other Christianities that are out there competing, and there is no one true definitive faith. Quote from Bart Ehrman from his best-selling book, Misquoting Jesus. Rather than actually having the inspired words of the autographs, or the originals, of the Bible, what we have are error-ridden copies of the autographs. No originals, only copies of the copies of copies of copies, as Bart Ehrman is often fond of saying. And also in the Da Vinci Code, this has certainly been very widespread in terms of disseminating false information. Quote, "The Bible is a product of man, my dear, not of God. The Bible did not magically fall from the clouds. Man created it as a historical record of tumultuous times, and it has evolved through countless translations, editions, and revisions. History has never had a definitive version of the book." Also decades earlier from Bajent, Lee, and Lincoln, Holy Blood and Holy Grail. When Constantine commissioned new versions of these documents, Christian writings, it enabled the custodians of orthodoxy to revise, edit, and rewrite their material as they saw fit, in accordance with their tenets. It was at this point that most of the crucial alterations of the New Testament were probably made, and Jesus assumed the unique status he has enjoyed ever since. The importance of Constantine's commission must not be underestimated. Of the 5,000 extant early manuscript versions of the New Testament, not one predates the 4th century. The New Testament as it exists today is essentially a product of a 4th century. Editors and writers, custodians of orthodoxy, adherents of the message with vested interests to protect. Is this true? Well, let's find out. Can we trust the New Testament if we don't have the originals? I think the answer is absolutely yes, we can. Here are our outcomes for today. One, we're going to have a clear purpose of the New Testament in terms of how it's made up, how it's been transmitted and translated, and also why we can trust in the message behind it. 2, we want to pursue truth and not our presuppositional biases. We'll get into that a little bit later. And 3, I hope by the end of this presentation, you'll see divine providence is at hand and behind the transmission of the New Testament text. Questions to answer. First, where are the autographs and what were they? How bad did scribes corrupt the text? And can we get back to the originals? Where are the autographs? It's a good question. The original New Testament documents. Well, there are no autographs. Next slide, please. Just kidding. No autographs exist for a lot of reasons, and 3 can be summed up. The climate. In the Mediterranean world, in the Roman world, there wasn't a lot of places that were arid and dry to be able to keep papyrus, which was plant-based. And unless you had a place like Egypt, which we've discovered all kinds of manuscripts from, even Nag Hammadi, from Oxyrhynchus, and also from Qumran in Israel. Persecution, of course, we know that Christians were in persecution in intermittent stages through the early centuries and went through some terrible hard times. And oftentimes their works and Christian works were ordered to be discarded, stolen, or burned. And they just get lost, just get misplaced, or just get discarded. No autographs exist or have been found in any ancient work, so that's comforting. We're in good company there. The earliest manuscripts were written on papyrus, which is, again, the reason why I shared that they don't last very long, maybe 100 years. If they're obviously kept in a very safe place, they could last longer. And we have two extremes, basically, about the autographs. The text could have been long-lasting and controlled, meaning that they were held by the authors or in good company, and they can be checked in terms of all the other copies that went out. Or you have the other end. You have a guy named Matthew Larson who contends that the text is fluid and there was really no sense of originals. They were just had revisions and copies and just were disseminated. But once a good copy of the text was produced, the physical autograph then could be discarded. So in terms of Evans and Larson, I think we can find a happy medium somewhere in the middle. Patristic and Greco-Roman book trade shed some light on this. So let's look very carefully. Let's look at the Gospels, for example, the fourfold Gospels. We've got a great insight from a 2nd century work called The Shepherd of Hermas, which is a Christian text. And here's a little quote, and then I'll explain it a little bit. Quote, "Therefore you will write 2 little books, and you will send one to Clement and one to Crypt. Then Clement will send it to the cities abroad, because that is his job. But Crypt will instruct the widows and orphans. But you yourself will read it to this city, along with the elders who preside over the church." So having this quote on the inside can show maybe this is how the Gospels were kind of disseminated. A copy is dispatched to Clement, duplicates it to be distributed to various cities and various targets where it's supposed to go. A second copy was sent to Crypt for widows and orphans. A third copy then retained by Hermas in order to be read in this city. So that's a very good possibility of how the Gospels were worked. And of course, we know Paul's letters, but here's a good example from Pliny the Younger in his letter to Septicus. "You have frequently pressed me to make a select collection of my letters." This is Pliny talking. "If there are any which show some literary finish, and give them to the public, I have accordingly done so. Not indeed in their proper order for time, for I was not compiling a history, but just as they were presented themselves to my hands. Farewell." Pliny illustrates how Paul's epistles could have been gathered and circulated as a collection. And of course, as we know from a lot of Paul's letters, he's written in conjoint with other people. For example, in Romans, at the end of Romans, it says, "I, Tertius, who write this letter, also send greetings." So those are some insights of how it's written. There's a couple lengthy quotes here that are very helpful, I think, from Harry Gamble, from the early text of the New Testament. So bear with me as we go through these. Listen to what he says about the communities. "Christian communities, far from being cultivated literary circles embedded in pre-existing social relationships, were sub-elite, voluntary religious associations, and their literature consisted of not of belles lettres, which is beautiful letters, which is like a fancy way aristocratic say of saying they were the top shelf letters, but of sub-elite genres, gospels, letters, apocalypses, and manuals of church order, hortatory tracts, acts of apostolic figures, and the like. Moreover, as a marginal, largely uncultivated, and indeed countercultural minority, whose texts had no broad appeal for outsiders, Christianity held no interest for the commercial book trade. Hence, it is not surprising that such evidence as we have about how the early Christian texts were produced and disseminated points to private channels among Christian communities." Gamble continuing, But it deserves notice that some early Christian texts appear to have enjoyed some surprisingly rapid and wide circulation. Already by the early decades of the 2nd century, Papias of Hierapolis in Western Asia Minor was acquainted with at least the Gospels of Mark and Matthew. Clement of Rome, Ignatius of Antioch, and Polycarp of Smyrna were all acquainted with collections of Paul's letters, and papyrus copies of various early texts were current in Egypt. The Shepherd of Hermas, written in Rome near the mid-2nd century, was current and popular in Egypt not long after. Equally interesting, Irenaeus' Adversus Heresies, against heresies, written about 180 in Gaul, is shown by papyrus fragments to be found its way to Egypt by the end of the 2nd century, and indeed also to Carthage, where it was used by Tertullian. If the New Testament is being read often, it seems to be it's being copied often. Gamble, finishing out here. The brisk and broad dissemination of Christian books presumes not only a lively interest in texts among Christian communities, but also efficient means for their reproduction and distribution. The goal of the New Testament is to preach the good news and not hold on to holy relics and preserve them. Seems to be the gospel is going out and people are going out with to different areas. And it's being read and copied. The text is from Alexandria to Antioch to Rome are saying the same thing in the text. Not exactly the same thing, but it's the same New Testament. The gospel mandate, geographical solidarity, and the church fathers' high regard for the apostles' writings. Here are some outcomes from the autographs. Completed authorial work that was released by the author for circulation and copying. In other words, once the author had finished his work, it was dispatched and then sent out. Once a work had been circulated in a community, that writing could not be significantly transformed, either by plagiarizing or altering its text, without these actions becoming known. May have been copies made under the control of the author or authors, which is possible. Unlikely autographs still existed and influenced the text by the time of our earliest copies. Even if they did, this alone would not guarantee that the existing manuscripts are reliable. How bad did scribes corrupt the text? This is basically an introduction to our manuscripts, an introduction to New Testament textual criticism. Now, there's many different tenets of New Testament textual criticism. I have 4 listed here. There's a good 12 kind of sub areas to look at, but we'll look at that in future videos. Textual criticism is the study of copies of any written document when the original is unknown or non-existent, in order to determine the exact wording of the original. The originals do not exist, so textual criticism would not be necessary if we had the originals. And textual criticism then search with care and diligence for the reading closest to the autographs. It's both a science and an art. Greek manuscripts are our first few centuries, the most important ones. Early versions and early copies in different languages, and also patristic citations. The early church fathers who are reading the New Testament and quoting the New Testament. The official manuscript numbers and fines are sent to the INTF. So then, how do we count all these manuscripts? Well, the main center is in Germany. It's called the Institute for New Testament Research. Quote from Myths and Mistakes. INTF is notified when a new manuscript is discovered and provided with images and as much bibliographical detail as possible. Its task then, especially with fragmentary manuscripts, is to ensure that the newly discovered manuscript is not part of some previously identified manuscript. In other words, if there's a fragment that's discovered, which is a lot of our manuscripts are fragmentary form, we want to make sure that it's not maybe a part of something that's already discovered. Then how do you score that? Do you count that as part of one complete manuscript, or is it a separate manuscript? So that's where textual critics have to figure these things out. If INTF believes the manuscript is a new one, it is assigned a new GA number and has its information added to the online list. And you can find that online. As of April 2019, 500, 885 Greek manuscripts are found. It's best to be a little bit more conservative with these numbers. Maybe 5,500 and less is probably what we're looking at. So definitely learn from the book Myth and Mistakes in New Testament Textual Criticism, where new young scholars kind of look at all the claims that apologists like myself and others have made, that even the eminent scholar Daniel Wallace has been checked, including the editors of the book sometimes can misstate outdated information. So this is important. The more manuscripts we have means we can cross-check for accuracy, identify changes and types of changes. This is kind of the total ream of the evidence. Greek manuscripts that we have today are 5,000 plus, so we'll be conservative with that number. Latin manuscripts then, the text was then translated into Latin and other languages. Certainly quite a lot of copies have gained momentum as time and space, the New Testament, and geographically the faith starts to move out and grow. The early church fathers could have over 1 million quotes. Even if all the Greek and Latin other language manuscripts were lost, the New Testament could be reconstructed from quotes alone. And here's how it looks. An original text is done. It is then dispatched. Of course, it's done in many different manuscript types. Papyrus, it comes from parchment, which is animal skin as well, and eventually leading into the Codex, which is the early book form. Actually, the Christians were one of the first ones to really catch on to this new technology at the end of the 1st century, 2nd century. And of course, you see the versions, different languages being translated in different languages where the New Testament is becoming available. And the church fathers who are making quotes. This isn't even an exhaustive list by any means. It seems to be just in alphabetical order. But very, very important quote here. This is from Bart Ehrman and Bruce Metzger, his mentor. If all of the sources for our knowledge of the text of the New Testament were destroyed, the patristic quotations, as we just looked at, would be sufficient alone for the reconstruction of practically the entire New Testament. That's important. That means we've got, in the first few centuries, not the Greek manuscripts alone, we have a lot, and we'll look at that in a bit, but we can reconstruct it. It's being quoted and written on and read quite a bit. What about the quality of the variants, meaning two texts are not alike? They're just not alike. They either have different word choices, word orders, spelling errors, perhaps. And here's a look at the breakdown. 75% of all the changes that we find in manuscripts, of those 5,000 Greek manuscripts, are spelling differences. There could be a rearrangement of word structure, syntax, you name it. 50% are minor differences, which could be spelling errors as well. 9% are meaningful but not viable. Basically, they just don't change the meaning of the text in any way. And 1% are very meaningful and very viable. And we're going to look at the two biggest ones that we have in the New Testament. And that's a 99.5 accuracy rate, which is pretty good considering 2,000 years of history of all the changes that could have come about. Now, can we get back to the originals? The scholarly view right now is that we can't, and that there's no point in looking. In fact, Bart Ehrman says we're kind of tinkering at this point. You're either certain that we can get back to the text, or we can't get back to the text at all. But essentially, that still is the goal of text criticism, is trying to ascertain, to figure out what the originals said. So Daniel Wallace, textual critic, gives a really good advice, I think, that we should keep to that we should adhere to. You don't want absolute certainty, and you don't want total despair either. If we look at it, certain cults and certain religious groups will want to be very certain about something. We received this revelation from God, or we received this from our leader. And they're very, very certain about what they believe, and they want to be able to quote precisely everything that they have. But that's not necessarily the way we want to go about things. Their concern is more of preserving a certain version. Oh, I have the real authentic text, as opposed to more than Christ himself, which is can be really scary, and we don't want to do that. And of course, unsound or foolish views of inspiration, that God perhaps zapped somebody in their head and started to write down and doesn't know what he wrote, but apparently that's a divine revelation. And this is from the occult. We don't want to look at this when we look at our Bible. This is from the occult called automatic writing, where apparently some ghost will write through the hand of someone and the person has no knowledge of what is going on. That's not the Bible. That's not the Bible or its inspiration or inerrancy or transmission. We don't want total despair either. We don't want people like Bart Ehrman saying, well, you can't really know anything about the text. And then he'll say, well, we do know what the text says. This is what we have. As Christians, we are committed to the truth. And of course, the person and the embodiment of truth is Jesus behind the New Testament. I'm committed to being a truth seeker, no matter where the evidence leads, the good, the bad, the ugly. As this presentation, I think, has shown, the truth is in the text, and that leads us to the ultimate reality, which is Jesus. Daniel Wallace, a great quote here. To be frank, the quest for certainty often overshadows the quest for truth. In conservative theological circles, this is, again, looking at us Christians, in conservative theological circles, and it's our temptation that we need to resist. To our shame, evangelicals have too often been more concerned to protect our presuppositions than to pursue truth at all costs. Here's just a list, and again, this is probably very outdated, a list of the comparison of the New Testament manuscripts compared to the manuscripts of certain historical writers, Livy, Tacitus, Suetonius, Thucydides, Herodotus, and of course the New Testament. Those numbers have certainly changed, but the New Testament still has a significant advantage in terms of the numbers. But if such skepticism is applied to the New Testament, we should be even more skeptical of these other ancient works as well. That seems about fair. So if so, we would know nothing from the Greco-Roman world if we couldn't trust the texts. The New Testament is the best tested ancient literature by far. It's just pretty early, and we've got the numbers. Methods for dating a manuscript. The biggest thing is the writing style, it seems to be. New Testament's textual critic can figure out when writing has changed. For example, if we looked at writing from English from like the 17th century to today, we can certainly see different changes in certain styles and how they would write and what size would it be? Would it be in all capitals? Would it be small? And this is how one clear indicator of trying to find out when a text was written. Archaeological indicators, where the text was found, what kind of shape is it in, paleographic dating. Of course, there's also DNA analysis, radiocarbon dating, etc. So there's lots of methods to try their best to try and find a date range. There's no precise dates, by the way, on any papyrus. It's always usually 50 years plus or minus, or 25 years plus or minus. Then the scribes. The scribes throughout the centuries have been varying in different degrees. It seems like they made more mistakes in the early centuries. Medieval scribes seemed to be better at copying. Scribes often added rather than omitted material. So that's interesting. They didn't take something out because they didn't like it. They would either want to clarify a point of doctrine or an important point Paul was saying, or even Jesus was saying. They might actually add or smooth out the text so that it reads better. So in 2,000 years of copying, only 2% growth of changes, which is pretty amazing. And here's an example. If we look at our manuscript traditions, Romans 8:1, we're all familiar with this if we're believers. There is therefore now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. Period. Full stop. Some manuscripts have that, some of the earliest ones, but we also have variants here. Now we have the second variant coming in. There is therefore now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus, who do not walk according to the flesh. That's kind of added to that. And then from that reading, from those two conjoint readings there, we have a third one to clarify even more, to bring it back into a positive. Who do not walk according to the flesh, but walk according to the Spirit. So the third reading originated obviously from the second and the first. That's interesting. And here's a list of, again, this might even be a little bit outdated, but 12 manuscripts roughly from the 2nd century, 64 manuscripts from the 3rd century. Again, a lot of these are fragmentary. They're not like complete books of the New Testament, but some of them have quite a lot of pages. Some have 75 pages. Some have a few. Again, some are just a few leaves. The estimated total of 124 manuscripts within 300 years of the composition of the New Testament. Here's a list of some of the key ones if you're familiar with textual criticism. Some of the ones like P75, I believe, are Paul's letters. And P52 is, of course, the most famous and the most controversial as well. That's what we're going to look at a little bit. P52 is like a credit card size, which was discovered in the early 20th century or early 19th century by C.H. Roberts. And significantly now, this has come under more scrutiny in terms of when the dating was. Last time I did a presentation like this, it was believed to be 8090 to 125. And I've updated this now in terms of the more scholarly research, the more it's compared to what were thought to be 2nd century manuscripts, has now been checked and changed and come under paleographical examination. And it seems like it's not quite as early, but a good kind of safe estimate could be 125 to 175. And this very well could be the earliest New Testament manuscript we have. This says, as you can see, the Gospel of John here a little bit. And yeah, remarkable discovery. Really neat. Now, when it comes to the actual whole Bible, the whole New Testament, skeptics will mention around 7 textual discrepancies. 3 we'll look at briefly. So it's good to be aware of these if you're not aware of them. It's better you talk to me first or do a course or get a book on textual criticism before you think that the Bible has not been quote unquote changed or had any errors or things like that. It's important to understand scholars have known these things for centuries. All of these changes, additions, mistakes, and let's look at them. 1 John 5:7-8 is a Trinitarian formula, as we'll see, and of course the long ending in Mark, and John 7:53, 8-11, which is the woman caught in adultery. Okay, so the Trinitarian formula is this basically: for there are 3 that testify, the Spirit, the water, and the blood. And it says these are in agreement. So this has long been recognized as not having any early textual support. It's definitely something that was added later. In fact, this passage made its way by political pressure, it seems, for the first time in 1522. The early church didn't know about this passage, and yet, in the Council of Constantinople in 381, explicitly affirmed the Trinity and the Trinitarian doctrine. So as much as this might be in our text, it's relegated as a footnote. So don't be surprised by some of these findings. They're in your Bible. I remember when I first understood what textual criticism was about 8 years ago, I had no idea what I was looking at. I had to watch Dan Wallace's presentation like 3 times over. I'm like, what is this? What is the Bible about? I thought the Bible maybe hasn't been changed, but that's not the way to look at that. It's not the way to look at that. Conclusion, the late formula only summarized what they had found. The Trinitarian doctrine is in there, but it didn't form all their declarations. So this just wait. Now the 2 big ones are, which we won't look at, but we'll just have a brief flyover of, the longer ending of Mark, which open up any Bible to have, any version. It's going to tell you that from 9 till 20, it's no longer, is not found in any early manuscripts. And probably is just a mishmash of like Matthew and Luke and John. Of course, there's something about snakes in that one, but you don't need to worry about that so much. So it's just important whenever you're reading from it that you're just aware of it. And the second thing is the woman caught in adultery. This is the most beautiful, the most favorite story that people have of the compassion and love of Jesus as a woman caught in adultery, caught in her sin, is about to be judged by those around her. And from what I understand from most textual critics, if they had a choice of keeping one of these in the Bible, they would definitely keep the woman caught in adultery story into the Bible and not the other one. So don't worry about these too much. Just know that they're footnoted, they're there, and here's why. Let's look at this. Scholars who produce translations, by and large, don't subscribe to the authenticity of such text, as we've mentioned. If not authentic, then they are still. Why are they still in our Bibles? Good question. For good reasons. First, for some, they function in the capacity of religious sociology as part of Christian heritage and consciousness. They've been there for a very, very long time, perhaps like 1,000 years even or so. Second, it's for the sake of tradition and timidity. Good reasons for timidity, for sure. Wallace also says, keeping these passages in our Bibles rather than relegating them to the footnotes seems to be a bomb just waiting to explode. All Ehrman did was light the fuse. So Ehrman can bring up these passages and people would be shocked that they're not in there. It needs to be stressed that these passages change no fundamental doctrine, no core belief, even though much emotional baggage is attached to them. No theological formula has been altered. The woman caught in adultery story is totally consistent with the character of Jesus and who he was. Two books I'll recommend really quickly. The bottom right one, New Testament Textual Criticism. Great little introduction book. It's like 70 pages long. It's a very easy read. I've gone over it 3 times. It'll introduce you to what the discipline is about, some terminology, some things to be aware of. Really, really good. And more intermediate level would be Myths and Mistakes, which is very recent, the last couple of years, where some young scholars have come together and realized, hey, there's a lot of misinformation and overstated claims that apologists and even textual critics themselves have made. Dan Wallace even gets called out. Peter Gurry, even one of the editors, gets called out in some things that he's said. So it's a very good check to be able to want to defend the Bible in the right way and not just at any cost. So can we trust the New Testament? What can we learn and how to respond? Well, concluding summary, the New Testament is the best attested of ancient documents. Now, that doesn't say the New Testament is true or everything is true in it, but that's what we have. It's the best attested document by far. 75% of the errors or mistakes are nonsense and have no significance. Less than 1% are in question. Of the 138,000 words of the New Testament, only 30 or 40 lines are in dispute. Again, 99.5% accuracy. That's pretty good. Radical skepticism and absolute certainty are attitudes to avoid. Skepticism that the New Testament can't be recovered is unjustified by the evidence. The New Testament is still very much in touch with the Christianity that finds its roots in the real Jesus. To close, I want to end with a quote from C.S. Lewis, and I think he puts it very nicely when it comes to our faith. The moment the miracle enters nature's realm, it obeys all her laws. Miraculous wine will intoxicate. Miraculous conceptions will lead to pregnancy. Inspired books will suffer all the ordinary processes of textual corruption. Miraculous bread will be digested.